Well, welcome, Nitsan Mesika. Did I pronounce your name right?
Mesika.
Mesika. It's so
Yeah.
beautiful. I think that's one of my favorite parts about Nitsan is that we've become, yeah, close friends and really intertwined in community. And I don't even really know how to say your last name, which I think is just like a beautiful part of being in relationship in a town like Boulder, where there can be so much depth and intimacy that's kind of comes seemingly out of nowhere. And yeah, and I just felt like really drawn to you from the beginning. I think at first I was a little intimidated by you when I first just saw you in community, but we hadn't yet established connection. And then I remember there was a moment when you put your hand on me, and I think there was some shared resonance over human design or something like that. And all of a sudden it was like all the ice broke, and I just felt this deep yeah, love and curiosity and sense of wisdom that comes from you, and feel really grateful and honored to have you on my podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What
So
it's worth, I never felt the ice, so.
yeah, that's good to know. So Nitsan is a wilderness guide and a psychotherapist, and I would call you a shaman. I don't know if you would use that term for yourself, but I feel those capacities from you. And well, today, basically a couple weeks ago, Nitsan invited me to an in-person gathering where she was exploring cluster B personalities and some of her different experiences, both working with clients and in her own personal life. And yeah, and also felt like you were hitting on something from a slightly new angle or illuminating something that maybe hadn't yet been described in words or just expressed in quite the same way that was kind of unlocking a sense of insight or wisdom in me in real time. So I would love to have you, yeah, share from the heart of what feels alive as it relates to that topic. And how would you introduce it in just a nutshell?
Well, first, thank you for that reflection. That talk was really important to me in the sense that it was probably the first time that I was like really inviting in people with curiosity about it and just like transmitting what has been like my life's work and the things that I've been really invested in. So it's really good to hear that impact. It's really good to hear that it's like I really believe that it's needed in this world.
Yeah. Great. So, what is cluster B personalities for someone who's never heard that term before?
It's divided into three clusters, where the second cluster is the most talked about these days, which includes narcissistic personality disorder, which is like the most talked about recently, borderline personality disorder, histrionic, and antisocial, which is what we typically call psychopath or sociopath. So a lot of my work, both as a therapist that specializes in this and as a human that, like lives in this society and lived in family systems and communities that had that, was to really try to figure out what it is, not just what it looks like.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, what is it?
The way that I understand it, um, is that we are born into this world and we come as pretty pure divine souls that experience this divine love, and then we're met with a situation that we weren't expecting. And it's very easy to blame the mothers and the parents for all the things, but the truth is that they have suffered through a similar separation, a similar wound. So we're born into a setting that does not meet us as the divine love that we are, does not meet us with that kind of like depth, coiling depth desire to just like uh, really know that we're not separate. We're not separate from one another. We're not separate from the universe. And so there's like a lot of stuff that happens developmentally, and it's kind of like a shocking thing for a young consciousness, that may have come with, a lot of like energetic powers and energetic gifts to give the world. but you come in as a little baby and you're like, shit. Um, no one's coming to feed me when I'm hungry. No one is holding me when I need the sense of safety. Um, no matter how hard I cry, no one understands that I'm tired. No matter how cold I am, there's no clarity of understanding that I need to be held. So again, like this is kind of like a more shamanic perspective of this, but what happens then is that it's almost like the soul needs to make a decision, like how to orient to this thing that is so devastating. And I'm not even talking about, like abuse and situations that are incredibly wounding and absolutely there and create the same thing. Like even with the smallest sense of separation, this could happen. So so it seems like there are a few strategies that a soul can choose when that happens. One of which is to say, my mother doesn't actually exist. There is no other that will come to save me. There is no other that will meet me and see me as the divine love that I am and as the divine love that they are. And instead, I will just believe that I'm the only one in existence. There is no other. I can't see an other because no matter how hard I cry and try, no one is meeting me. Um, and so that's kind of like a really desolate, really painful realization. And it's almost like a strategy of mind of saying, there's no one here, there's only me. There are objects that are running around and moving things. And I know that if I do this, the object will give me food. And if I do scream this loud, this will happen. But it's like this orientation of like I'm alone in this world. I'm the center of this existence. And if I actually believe and trust that mom exists as a human, that there is another soul in here, then the level of pain that I will have to endure in understanding that this person is neglecting me is so difficult and hard that I prefer to live under this assumption that there's only me here. And that's like the core consciousness of a narcissist. Like you don't fucking exist. There is no you. There is just me. And this entire landscape is desolate, painful. I'm the victim of this existence. A lot of narcissists are deep victims. They have a lot of like um, complaints and dissatisfaction with everything that happens to them. And the sense that they bring is that it's all very arbitrary. It's just it's just this like really weird video game that I'm stuck in and things happen to me. And so in the narcissistic consciousness, even though so say that I was a narcissist, I'm looking at Tucker, I'd be like, there's a thing called Tucker in the world. I have an interject, like a file on Tucker. If I do this, this is what Tucker does. This is the Tucker being does this thing. It will move this way, it will do that thing. And then Tucker comes in and tells me his feelings are hurt. I'm like, okay, that's another point of input for the Tucker blob that is moving around. I don't actually believe or understand that Tucker has his own consciousness and is the center of his own universe. I don't actually accept that Tucker has feelings, only that Tucker says these things. And when Tucker says these words, there's a higher probability that Tucker will do these things. And so I don't know what it brings up for you, but for a lot of people who have experienced relationships with narcissists, there's this like feeling of I don't actually exist. What I say doesn't really matter. No matter how loud I tell you, like, hey, this is my experience here. There's like no acceptance or understanding that you actually have a soul and a center and an experience There's only the narcissist's perspective of you.
Yeah.
How does that?
Yeah. I'm with you. Um, hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so I guess what I'm wondering is how can one be in relationship with that?
You're running to like narcissists 301 already.
Sh- I'm happy to go somewhere else if you feel it'd be better to wait to move into that later
Yeah,
on.
I think that's really a good thing to kind of like keep to the end. I want to actually speak to other strategies that are used in those situations because then there's a few more strategies that fall into the cluster B pool, and one of these is the borderline strategy.
Mm.
And the borderline strategy is almost the exact opposite. The borderline strategy says mother is mother is the source of everything. She is actually the one consciousness that is like strong and big and powerful and can create movement in this world, bring me food, hold me, all of that. The only way I can be safe is abandon this being, like become like a very, very, very thin thread of soul and be fully invested in that kind of like powerful being that is outside of me. Because if I manage to manipulate that, then I'll be fine. So there was like one episode of Pinky and the Brain, I think, or maybe something else where there's this like one bigger being and a tiny little being sitting in the head and like pulling the levers. It's like, eh, eh, eh. So that's kind of like how I think of borderlines sometimes. It's like their deepest investment is to live inside your mind and pull the levers. Their deepest safety is in uh, manipulating, managing the consciousness of the other that is becoming the center of their world so that they will be safe. So whenever you do anything that is feeling in the least like an abandonment, like they're not going to be able to latch and leech onto you, um, it will evoke rage
Mm.
because that's like the deepest unsafety you can possibly create is if you give them a sense that they don't have control over you, give them a sense that you're going to leave. And so the wounding again comes from like, oh my God, I'm a baby lying in this crib. There's no way I can be safe unless I control my mother. Mother is power. And so then it just keeps getting transferred and transmuted into love interests or authority figures, and the core of it is actually self-abandonment. The more like the more loose the central thread is, the more you are actually you are the only thing that exists, not me. So the way that I look at it is like the narcissist says that you are me, all of you is me. Whereas the borderline says, I am you. I'm not even here. You are the thing that is here. And I need to like, I
Mm.
call it the mistletoe. Like I need to like become the parasite that sucks your life force so that I'll be able to exist. And I don't have roots and I can't actually source from the ground. So
Mm.
that's the second one. Um, yeah, let's like stay with these because histrionic and antisocial are a little different, but
Mm.
yeah. But that's kind of like the I am you, you are me. What both of them lack is the capacity to meet another in depth sovereignty. Like, I am me, you are you, we are us, and we can dance. And
Mm.
so I honor you, I see you, I understand that you are not me, I understand that I'm not you. And and I think it has been my experience in this society that it is, first of all, a spectrum, and that to some degree Everyone is wounded by it.
Mhm.
And then one of the things that I've identified is that there are people who are obviously wounded by it because almost all parents here carry some of it, but are not neither narcissistic nor borderline. There's something else, and that's a core part of my work, and I would like love to share more about that.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
my question is just go on. I'm so with you. I'm just really in every word that you're speaking and
Mhm.
yeah, where should we go next?
Well, the so it all ends up being about empathy, right? Because people are like, oh, narcissists are not empathetic, and then there's like this whole like song and dance of like how empathy is important and healthy and good for you, etc. And then the more I was like working with that aspect of soul and consciousness and the I thou and the we, because I come from like more tribal consciousness, more collective awareness, and then coming into here and seeing what individuation causes, um, I started noticing that there's another thing. There's another thing. There's another way of orienting to that core wound. And it creates something that in my book would be called a personality disorder. It's not in the DSM. It is in ways in social media and people are talking about it. It's part of the rising consciousness that is coming up. But I opt to name it a personality disorder. I call it the hyper-empath personality disorder. I think that it comes from the same place, which is I'm still in that crib. I'm still not attuned to. I'm still not being taken care of. I'm not going to make my mom non-existent, and I'm not going to make myself non-existent, not fully. Um, but instead, what I'll do is I will just like sit there in the crib in the dark, and I will hope to all hopes that mom is good and mom is loving and mom is going to come to me. And so what happens is that she ends up coming. You know, she doesn't do it because of attunement. She doesn't do it because of depth care necessarily. But what it does is that it validates that I call it toxic hope in my vernacular. I call it toxic hope. Like I'm sitting there and I'm just gonna be like, I know that she's good. I know that she's loving. I know that if only all I need to do is just like really, really wait and believe in her. And then she comes. And then I'm like, you see, she does love me. She does exist. I do exist. And so this construct of toxic hope creates wounds of like people pleasing, wounds of perfectionism, because then you know that baby turns into a toddler, turns into a child that becomes incredibly attuned to mom, incredibly. Because if I know exactly what's going on with her and I know what her feelings are and I know and I just like really believe that she wants to take care of me and she loves me even if she's a narcissist, even if she's a borderline. And then the random thing that comes my way that feels like care, I will take it as proof that I'm doing the right thing, that mom might end up being the loving mom that I need her to be. And so um there are certain characteristics to this like hyper empath personality, but I think that it is incredibly prevalent, incredibly so. Moreover, I will say, and I will say that it is a wounding. It's not I would characterize it as a personality disorder. Uh, a lot of like people in healing professions are that. A lot of people who get wounded by relationships with narcissists and borderlines are that. And they keep asking themselves, like, what am I doing wrong? Like, I've done all this growth work and I've done all of the skills and I know how to NVC like no other. And I've done so much medicine and I've done all of these things. And I'm like, you're a straight A student, still not going to change your mom. And the belief is that, and so the belief is that if I just do my darndest, and I will just like see her and love her and believe in her, she will turn into a being that I can actually connect and interact with. And so why am I calling it a disorder? Like, why would empathy be a problem, right? So I'll just like give you an example of like what happens in a lot of like romantic relationships, which is um like you somehow, not surprisingly, found yourself with a narcissist because that's what you know from home, because that's your your mountain to climb. That's your, this is what you believe that if you will manage to heal, you will have your mother. That's why it's a personality disorder. So you found, you in a crowd, you managed to find the narcissist to be in relationship with, and then you start climbing that Everest of yours.
Mm.
And you say something about how you would prefer things to be a little different, and they get really angry with you. And they're like saying that you're complaining all the time, right? You know what I'm talking about, right, Tucker?
I think so. I think so.
And so you're like, no, no, I just, like this thing happened, and I prefer this, just like some of my needs to be met here. And then once again, you're like the bad guy, you're complaining. And so what you do as a hyper empath is that you sit back and you're like, I can see their perspective. I can see how I could have done this better, because you're a perfectionist as well. You're a perfectionist, you're a hyper empath. So you're sitting there and you're like, oh, I understand what they're experiencing. And I could have done this a little bit better. And then you come in and you apologize and you take accountability and you want, and you're like, oh, this is how I'm going to grow and be even better, because you're a perfectionist. And so you come in and you say, oh, I'm sorry for this and that and the other. Maybe I was a little worked up. Maybe I did this and that. So you find yourself apologizing for something really minor, despite the fact that something really bad might have started the whole thing. And so that appeases them, because they're like, oh, here you are. You know that it's your fault. And then the whole thing calms down, and you find yourself yet again like being like, oh, here she is. Like, I got the crumb. She's gonna heal. She's gonna love me at the end of this. But what actually happened is that you gave empathy in a place where you're not receiving empathy at all. What happened is that you apologized for something minor and you never received acknowledgement and apology for something much bigger that was happening to you. Your being was not seen. Your being was not empathized with. And somehow you missed that. Somehow you stayed in this kind of like, oh, okay, now we're better. And then it happens again and again and again and again and again and again, to the point that I call it being abusable. Because, and so like how tricky this is, because people are like, yo, what are you blaming the person who's being abused for the abuse? I'm like, no, I'm not. But if something's happening to you and you keep feeding it and you don't actually say, hey, I'm not going to give you empathy unless you give me empathy. That's it. That's my boundary, period. Or I actually have nothing to apologize for. And you have a bunch to apologize for. And I don't have that kind of like core center that knows how to keep boundaries, then I'm absolutely contributing to the dynamic. So this answers a little bit what you were asking about earlier, and happy to kind of like dive into that a little bit more. But
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, one thing that I've experienced is that when that repair process happens by taking accountability and apologizing and all of that, regardless as to the percentage of reciprocity on the other side, if it's not relatively equal reciprocity, then it feels like a surface level repair where it's like, okay, we did the thing and now we're hugging and now it seems like things are okay. But like on a soul level, like deep in the gut, it's like this feels actually incomplete, but there's almost a gaslighting type process that goes on towards oneself. It's like I'm like, well, we're hugging and it feels okay, and we're both crying, we're saying we love each other and it's not gonna happen again. But there's like it's like a short-term memory loss of
Yeah.
the pattern, and then it's like you just want, like the body just wants the relief of it feeling like it was a true repair. But it's this really skimpy repair that is like losing the depth and the breadth that will lead to a lasting, healthy, sustainable relationship in the long run.
Exactly. And I think that you're really pointing to the fact that at the heart of it all is a deep desire
Mm.
to be seen as the consciousness that you are behind your eyes, to be loved for that, and to be seen for the pain that you're experiencing. I think that almost every situation, like you were just describing, if the other person would just sit next to you and say, "Hey, I really feel your pain. I understand what you're going through." That would be enough. Now, the truth of it is that it needs to actually like have substance. It's not just words. So what happens in this reality, in this society, is that someone will say something like this, like I just said, and then everybody will start saying that
Yeah.
thing, but not being the thing and not doing the thing. So what starts happening is that you're starting to feel like you're having a relationship with an AI that really knows how to say the right thing and validate your feeling and reflect your words. And so there's like almost like a manual on how to behave non-narcissistically despite the fact that you're a narcissist. And that creates even more confusion because you're sitting there and you're like, you say you feel my pain, but it doesn't feel like you do. And and then you start, because you're a hyper empath, what starts happening is like, but am I doing the same thing? Because I can be that too. And that's like a core pitfall of the hyper empath, of like, whatever you see that you know could be changed, should be changed, would be better for you, will answer your needs better, la 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 la, in relationship, you're not saying, and that's perfectly okay to request. Maybe I'll be met, maybe I won't be met. Instead, what typically happens is that you you wear it. You're like, but I could have done the same thing. I remember this one time that I did this, and so I get them.
Yeah.
They're fine. They're not fine. That you can find a scenario in which this could have happened doesn't mean that this is who you are all the time. And it's just like almost like a short circuit mechanism that creates, again, this abusability, this availability to be abused because you can find the abuser in you. But are you living into it? Is this your day-to-day choice to behave this way? Is this the day-to-day relational practice that you do with your partner? No. So that's where the boundary is of like, wait. Sure. I could have done this. I'm going to apologize for the potentiality of being able to do this. But I'm not seeing them doing the same thing. And that's where the line drops.
Yeah. And this word projection gets used so often in our communities now. And I feel like just a short circuit way to deconstruct any conversation is just like, you're projecting on me right now, because it's true. Like I'm from some vantage point, that will always be true, because there's always a way in which projection is like, that's
Mhm.
part of the definition of projection from one perspective, is that whatever like story or experience we're having is a projection. And so, but it's when do you like, so often when I hear that, I'm like, oh yeah, damn. And then I internalize it, and then I just try to like go inwards and I basically disappear. And then I
Mhm.
take on full responsibility. But I'm losing relationship with the sort of the scale of the projection. It's like, okay, yeah, you're right. There's like 16% happening on my end, but there's like 60% on the other end. But the 16% on my end, because I'm taking responsibility for it,
This
feels
is this
more
is your quicksand. Just you're just doing it right now.
like
So it's like here's the kind of like, do you mind if I like use this as an
yeah, please.
example? Because it was perfect.
Yeah.
Um, everybody projects.
Right.
Given. Given. Like we sit here and like we all hold interjects. We all have files internally on people. We're like, oh, so like I know Tucker. We used to be housemates for a minute, and I met you in different, and I have a story of who you are and how you might behave and how you might, and a narcissist will not know that Tucker even exists. So it doesn't like I'm like, oh, okay, like you say this, you say that. I think I know better than you what you're gonna be and what you're gonna do because there's only me and your opinion doesn't even fucking matter. So I'm the one maintaining the interject inside of me. Period. A borderline will be more invested in their interject inside your head. It's like I'll be invested in editing the file about me in you
Mm,
all the time.
mm,
Okay. What a healthy person, not many people are, or yeah, I wouldn't go like into a hyper-empath right now, but what a healthy person would say is this: I have a file. Here's Tucker. Tucker says these things about himself. I actually trust Tucker's idea of himself more than I trust my idea of Tucker. And I'm absolutely willing to engage with, like, oh, Tucker says that these are his feelings. Of course, it makes more sense that he knows what his feelings are than me. Do you know that's kind of like the piece of grandiosity in gaslighting? What is gaslighting if not saying, oh, you think you're this? I know you're actually that,
mhm,
right? And so you're sitting there in your consciousness and you're like, but it's like, I know that it was X. Why are they saying that it's Y? It's like because they don't care that you think that it's X.
mhm.
So coming back this like interject and projection, a hyper empath would look at projection and say, oh, but I'm projecting too. So projecting is not bad. Or if projecting is bad, it means I'm bad. And so you take the whole baby in bathwater and toss it together into this like lump instead of like having the nuance of uh there's actually nothing I can do to change your projection on me, and there's no empathy in this connection, and so I'm a no, right? And saying, oh, I have this projection of you. I'm curious if that lands. Does that I have some humility about the idea that I have of you, and I'm willing to update my idea of you based on your input. That's a relational practice.
Mhm.
To me, it's almost a diagnostic tool.
Mhm.
If I am interacting with you and you're not willing to update your idea of me based on my idea of me, I'm like, oh, hi. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Could you give a empathy 101 for one who maybe hasn't I'm not saying this about myself necessarily, but for one who hasn't experienced maybe a consistent, deep, grounded, beautiful display of relational empathy? Like what does that look
Mm.
like? What does that feel like? And how does one know when they're receiving that, not just in a wrapping paper verbal way, but in a deeply embodied way?
So I would say that the deepest tool that one can have with like really understanding that reciprocity is just curiosity.
Mm,
If someone is curious about your being, like genuinely like hey, what's going on in there? What are your thoughts and feelings? oh, really? You looked for a moment like you were this thing, but it's really interesting to hear that when you make this face, this is what it means. I was making up a story that it means something else. Thanks for letting me know. Now I know how to be in relationship with you. That's healthy. Does that sound
Mhm.
familiar?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of like a good way. I think that when empathy goes sideways, it's because we just give it and we don't allow for it to be received. It's when we make up excuses for other people because we can put ourselves in their shoes.
Mhm.
It's giving kind of like abundant, unconditional love in the hope that it will heal something, in the hope that it will bring that empathy back to us when in fact there's zero capacity on the other side. Um, so that's kind of like where hyperempathy becomes a problem in the interpersonal connection.
Yeah. So say we're in connection and you're contracted into a narcissistic state. You're sort of in IFS terminology, sort of blended with that part, you could say. And I say, I'm not going to show you empathy until I receive empathy. How that person in that state of consciousness might not even have access to the awareness of what empathy is to be able to give it. And I'm just curious, like, how can one ask for what they need, maybe in like a more concrete, specific way that might help bring more awareness beyond just the word empathy itself? Or if that's
This
even
was
a good
six
shadow.
different topics, just so you know.
Okay.
First of all, I don't necessarily agree with like parts languaging. I think
Okay.
you know this about me. Secondly, um, though I can see like how someone can like collapse into more narcissistic manifestation, I think that it is actually an unhealthy, it's already kind of like an unhealthy thing, meaning to say there's a diagnosis that is called cluster B personality, which is people who are actually shifting.
Mm.
So I was in a relationship once that with someone that had this kind of like cycle of like almost like 3 days borderline, 4 days narcissism. It was just like astounding because it's like I don't exist, you don't exist. I don't exist, you don't exist. It was like exhausting. Um, and so I agree that there's like that potentiality of like dropping so fully in here that nothing else exists, and that's you can call it trauma response. I call it a victim pattern, or fully blasting out, feeling like completely dependent, and um, so yeah, that's kind of like just like the axioms of the question that you were asking, but um, yeah, can you repeat the
Well, I
latter
guess,
part of it?
yeah, theoretically, if you mentioned it, it's a spectrum. If one is really on the low end of the spectrum, but definitely, there it
Hmm.
comes out. You can feel flavors of it at times, but
Hmm.
then they're triggered, right? Something happens and they contract, and
Hmm.
it's almost like they go down the spectrum. When you're in relationship with somebody, a coworker, a romantic partner, whoever it is, when they are, how
Right,
can
like
you
the
be,
asking for empathy or setting a boundary
yeah,
with
other
empathy is
than
what you're
just
asking,
like
right?
walking away and not being in a relationship with that person, which
Right.
maybe is the answer, is there a way to kind of like help bring more, like bring them back up the spectrum, so to speak, in a way that can still come from a sovereign place without falling into the empathetic pattern?
So the spirit of the times right now is that adult narcissists can't be fixed. That there's like no way to change that. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I do think that the gateway to actually create healing in society is through the hyper-empaths, so that the true health can come from stopping the what you're asking about.
Great. Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Meaning to say, as long as we're in the savior, right? As long as we're in this, like, if only I do this, is there anything that I can do so that blah, 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 blah will, or my needs will be met, or la, 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 you're still in the pattern.
Yeah.
And so as long as you're holding that pattern, you're entrenching them in the other pattern. And one of the things I didn't speak about yet is like how societally we're breeding that. We're breeding narcissism and we're breeding hyperempathy because almost all therapists nowadays are hyperempaths. Almost all mothers that had narcissistic parents become hyper attuned. And then what happens is this, like the tenets of therapy right now is almost like be a mother of a 2-year-old. And not because like that's not the true relational practices that therapists use, but the tenets are don't share a lot about yourself unless it is in service of the client. Yeah. It's like I become a blank non-entity, right? Like what is that if not the mother of the narcissist? And then I'm going to sit here and give you like abundant unconditional regard and acceptance of all that you are. Just like there's nothing wrong with you. You're just going through a blah blah blah. You're just and so I'm like, what are you doing? You are creating narcissism when you're doing that because it becomes so not everyone is doing this, but the therapeutic relationship is becoming a mirror of like a universe where you're the only consciousness and you can do no wrong. Everything is happening to you. I'm like, and so the hyper attuned mother that comes from this like narcissistic upbringing, and she's like, I was never like acknowledged. I was never seen for who I am. All I need to be and do is like this like empathetic, loving, hyper attuned being that just like sees the child and unconditionally loves them. And what happens is that it becomes like a little boundaryless. It becomes like the child doesn't have a context in which there is another being to actually bump into, another being that has like depth impact, that has depth self. So there's no modeling of depth self. And so the therapeutic model as we have it right now is ridden with hyper empathetic beings are breeding narcissistic consciousness, even in non-narcissistic people.
Mhm.
Moreover, I will say that the entire society is currently geared into saviorship. So me too. And I'm not gonna like, I'm not saying that horrible things aren't happening. I'm just saying that we are so geared towards taking care of the whiniest, loudest one, not necessarily the one that is harmed.
Mhm.
So the louder you are, the whinier you are, the more attention you get. And if so, tell me if this sounds familiar. Again, you're a man, you have a girlfriend, she's hurt. I don't know why you may have not cleaned the dishes.
Mhm.
And and then she comes at you and she's like, I'm hurt. You're bad. And you say, wait, what? But I had no intention to hurt you. And then she says, no, you're defensive. You're being defensive. You're wrong. I'm hurt. You're bad. You're being defensive. And I read or saw on TikTok that that means that you're a narcissist and you're gaslighting me right now. And I'm like, holy shit, we're in trouble. Because what just happened is that um, you were completely steamrolled. Your being, your essence, your understanding of reality, your intentions are not important anymore because you're a man and she's hurt and therefore you're bad and you're a narcissist. And I say if you're being attacked, it's completely fair to be defensive. There's nothing wrong with being defensive when you're being attacked. And so societally, what is happening right now is that we're breeding narcissism. And it's to some degree, the consciousness is moving to the feminine. So the feminine is like holding this like victim mindset. Everything is like done to me. Um, Everybody's wrong and bad. Um, yeah, and it gives me a right to attack them, which is if you really think about it, is like a core narcissistic quality. So to come back to your question and how to work with it.
Just tell me how to fix everyone, Nitsan.
How to fix everything. First of all, send them to me. Um, no, there's a lot that can be done in practice, in boundaries. It's not about like what everybody's like thinking of as skill is typically like more tools to become uh more of a wishy-washy empathetic being, right? Because even that question of like, what can I say or be and do so that they will be healthier, better? I'm like, no. Start with this one. Show up to the world as a consciousness that is aware of itself and aware of the other. And practice being what I call a compassionate asshole.
Mhm.
It's one of the books that I'm writing right now is going to be called The Compassionate Asshole, but Trungpa Rinpoche coined the term idiot compassion. A lot of people who are hyper empathetic are giving idiot compassion, meaning to say they're just going to love on you. They're just going to enable you through accepting everything. Whereas sometimes the most compassionate thing that you can do is actually set a boundary in such a way that might actually be cutting and hurting. Um, but it is the greatest service that you can do for them. And so, for your question, I think that having your own boundary, knowing who you really are fully, where you begin and end, what are your capacities, what are the things that you're willing to do, not willing to do, and standing up to that with everything that you got, including the boundary of like, wait a minute, I'm just giving way too much empathy right now. And there's no reciprocity, so I'm a no. Or saying, hey, I'm willing to be here with you and give you this empathy, and just know that I have an expectation of reciprocity. I'm curious about your experience. I'm not going to do that infinitely. I need curiosity for my experience. Completely valid and fair. So those are kind of like the little things of like coming back into a sovereignty that is not uh, so unhealthy that it becomes narcissistic, coming into a synergy that is not so unhealthy that it becomes borderline. Yeah, it's a lot of work. It's not
Yeah.
impossible. No.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious in your own journey or maybe the journey of some of your clients or friends.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I see a lot play out in, especially in conscious communities, is, people are like, oh yeah, boundaries, that's a thing. I like never learned that as a kid. And then they set boundaries, but it's how I experience them sometimes is like, wow, that was really severe. And it's almost like the
Mm,
pendulum swings
right.
far in it, and there's almost a
That
lack of
makes sense.
well, if that hurts you, that's kind of that must be your shadow. And I'm like, well, maybe, but maybe you also just could work on the communication capacity of it. But there's kind of this like, it's my truth, it's my boundary, I'm going to do what I want. And I don't experience them as embodying narcissism in any sort of meaningful way. But in the art of practicing the boundaries, it like swings in that ballpark, and it starts to feel odd to receive that energy from, a close friend, for example.
Well, I will say that I think that that actually comes from a deeper societal wounding that has more to do with lack of tribal consciousness and collective consciousness than it is from um, the specificities of how the individual is separated. And so, um, yeah, so a lot of what is offered in the way of healing and fixing these things is very similar. So it's allopathic. That's how I would say it. Much like the diagnosis is allopathic, it's like it's going to be based on symptoms and not on core, this
Mhm.
is what is happening. Similarly, the solution and the medicine is allopathic. So instead of being like the whole food or the whole society or the wholeness of a medicine, it will be a part, it will be the active ingredient. And so it will be behave this way or do that thing or hold boundaries. Boundaries are this. And I'm like, it's really about self-knowing. It's really about boundaries. Boundary is a self-knowing.
Mhm.
Do you agree with that
Yeah.
statement? And
Well,
so
I come from this.
yeah, so like it's like, oh, this is my capacity and I'm willing to step up until here and not past that. And and that's actually a compassionate thing. It's just like I'm a no and you can fuck off. It's like this is where I stop. And you're welcome to come all the way here and meet me, but I'm not passing that point. So that's a completely different thing than being like a harsh, like boundaries are the way to go,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So so that's why I call it compassionate assholery. It's not just being an asshole.
Yeah.
It's about really it being a practice of compassion. First and foremost to yourself, but then in recognizing the other and being in a relationship with an other. If the other is not willing to come and meet at the boundary, then maybe you can't work with them. And that's perfectly fair. But even the way that you were saying it, which was like it had like a clue to it, which is this person sets up a boundary this way, and you're like, but wait, it's a little more complicated than that. That's a curiosity. You're coming in with like, hey, like, where is that line actually is? What is your inner experience? How can we meet? And if it comes from that place of like two sovereign beings who know, I end here, we can meet in this place, then you're doing the right thing.
Well, something that there's been a number of experiences over the past couple of years where there's sort of three, you call it three different agentic beings. There's the myself, the other individual, but then there's also a collective that we're a part of. And it's kind of
Mhm.
a sensing into, um, yeah, I might not be a full fuck yes to doing some action, but you know what?
Mhm.
It feels like that's like taking one for the team by kind of doing something that maybe is going to have a little bit of a short-term impact on me. Is going to really help the collective. It's gonna really be important for the unfolding of the larger whole. And when to find that balance of, yeah, like, okay, there's something coming up. I'm feeling that there's some tension or resistance around that. And there's a deeper kind of a soul knowing or a deeper kind of intuitive knowing that this is really important. And I might even not have a cognitive reason why, but there's a larger yes that is guiding me into my action. And I think
Beautiful.
maybe that might be part of the Western culture of like, if my in so, separate being egoic self is a no, then I'm a no, and I'm gonna set up a boundary. And I'm like, I guess I poke holes in that, and I don't think that that's necessarily something to ignore. That's information that is important, but are there other capacities or dimensions of our being that we can also attune to, including that which we might call the other, um, which ultimately on some level is a part of ourself.
Yes. So I love this because the way that I were into it, the transmissions that I'm receiving, the learning that I have with like the shamans and the teachers that I am aligned with and tuned with, is that there is like this level of personal that is what we're talking about. It's the suit, so to speak, that the soul wears to meet another. And then on the soul level, it doesn't really matter, right? It's like he said, she said, la la la. I know my purpose. I know what I'm doing. I know like what it feels like to coil with another soul, like have a shared goal and purpose. And then the little things stop being important. But
Mm.
if you kind of like go further up into this kind of like more monadic unity, non-dual perspective, then all of it is a reflection of self. Like we're all narcissistic. It's all wounding that we're creating and perpetuating in on ourselves, into ourselves, and it's a constant kind of like mirror to look at, this is the part of me that still needs healing. And so just like from that perspective, from that like philosophy, faith, whatever you want to call it, um, the consciousness is currently deeply invested in separation, in like you like there's just like the narcissistic is actually non-dual if you
Mhm.
think about it.
Yeah.
The narcissist is an unhealthy non-dual existence. It's like there's only me, but it's a desolate, horrible landscape where there's actually no connection through soul to the divine love that can run through you.
Mhm.
And um when you kind of like come into those like non-dual states, then the beauty of it is that a lot of transmission is coming in right now in the way of like this like unity, divine love. We're all gonna blast into this like universal love. And so we can speak about it in like all of those levels, but on the soul level, a lot of narcissists and borderlines are actually incredibly beautiful, powerful souls.
Mhm.
They're often incredibly attractive because of that. Um, yeah, I mean, I can talk more about that, but does it
Yeah.
answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Yeah. Um, I'm curious about the cultural element, and you were
Mhm.
born in Israel, is that right? Or you spent a
Mhm.
significant amount of time there? And yeah, I'm just curious. You've alluded to this piece at a few points, and I'd love for you to just
Yeah.
dive into it more fully.
Well, I will say that like if I my lineage is like from this island in the Mediterranean that is like the oldest known like Jewish diaspora, and it's because it was an island, it was also pretty contained. And I'm the second generation of that um location. And and so I don't necessarily identify with Israeliness. I think of it as like there was like a generation and a half that we stayed there as refugees and as dislocated natives of a certain land that I cannot go back to. And in that, like, I don't feel much difference between being in Israel and being in the US. However, I will say that the consciousness of the Jewish kind of a collective is a lot more geared towards tribal consciousness. We are raised in an us and a we that is far, far, far greater than anything I've seen in the US from my own experience. Um, like I remember moving here and walking out the door for the first time and being like, oh, this is not my family.
Mhm.
The people here are not my family. Shit. Who are they? Whereas, in Israel, everybody's my family. Everybody's like to some degree long distance relative. And so there's like a visceral feeling and experience of being part of a whole and part of a collective and part of a, you would call it community here, but it's not. It's like a people. It's like a blood um relationship and connection that I think creates like an attunement in my own antennas of what is missing and why it hurts so much. And so I can talk about that forever, but I will say this. Um, it feels like almost everybody here is walking with this like deep heartache of like deep desire for like for belonging, for a connection, for being seen, for being part of a bigger whole. And at the same time, depth of investment in like, I am me. And I'm individuated, and being independent is the thing. It's the way to go. And I'm like, what do you do? You get individuated and you get independent because you are connected, because you are loved, because you belong. You get to shine your authenticity.
Mhm.
You can't be uh collective of fully individuated beings. It just and this is why it feels like so upside down. It's like everybody's like invested in individuation and then they come together and they're like, oh, what about this whole relational thing?
Mhm.
So that feels like a core difference in my experience of humanity coming from that background and into this, and why I think that I have something to offer in it, despite it being painful.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm just the US politics have come to mind a few times, and just when you were speaking, I was watching Tim Walls's speech yesterday, and he was saying that he grew up in a small town with 400 people, and then he was a public school teacher for 30 years at the same little school in Minnesota, was the football coach, and was married. And there's like this sense of and like all these people were just loving it and like applauding and cheering so loudly. And I'm projecting here like 100% because I was feeling this, and I don't want to presume that everyone in the audience was also feeling some sense of this, but it almost feels like also like you're saying on a collective psyche level, there is this longing, this hunger for that deep sense of like grounded, stable connection to tribe, to family, to
Yeah.
place. And yeah, and then it's just interesting because on the other end of it is Donald Trump, who I guess correct me if I'm wrong, to me he feels like a poster child for like one of the most obvious and potentially toxic examples of narcissism. And it's just wild that yeah, I guess my question is, I'm curious how you make meaning, or if you have a story or a belief around what's happening in the short term in terms of like these couple of years of history that we're in here in the US and maybe globally. And then if you have also another perspective that's like the long arc, like over the next 100 years, say, do you have a sense of what consciousness is going through and why these ruptures and these
Mhm.
awarenesses are coming online? And like, yeah, I'm curious from those two
You
perspectives.
love your big questions, don't you, Tucker?
uh Story of my
So
life.
I will say this, far be it from me to diagnose Donald Trump. I sure have my opinions. Um, but as you were speaking, and in particular when you talk about what's coming and the consciousnesses, etc., there's like definitely a lot of like downloads that are coming these days. And um, I want to say something about the difference between the cultures and how it relates to what you were just asking. It's not that Israel doesn't have wounding in the collective realm or in the family realm, but the family is safety. It's unwavering. It never goes away. It will always be there for you. No matter how dysfunctional they might be, when I got here, to hear of the dysfunction that happens in the core family and how separate it is from the um how do you call it, like the how do you call it, the bigger family, like the extended family, right? So how like the family unit has kind of like collapsed into this like mother, father, and like couple kids. And whereas in Israel, it's like big families that are like living like no more than 30 minutes away from one another and they meet every weekend. And it's like this like juicy strata where feelings are welcome, authentic expression is welcome, acceptance is almost like given. You're not going to be cast out. It's just like not possible because you're tribe. Um, so imagine that this like attachment layer exists to such a degree that it just does not exist here. When people talk about attachment here, I'm like, you don't know what it is. And so this attachment layer exists, and then shit happens, wars, and not going to go into details, but shit happens. Israelis suffer massive trauma, but the trauma is not at the core of being a human being, of being part of tribe. Whereas what happens here, which was really shocking to me, is it's actually the quite the opposite. So it's not that the world doesn't do things to you, but at the core of it, this is a pretty safe space. You don't have wars here. You can pretty much pick places to live where there's not a lot of crime. You can live a pretty sweet life. But what happens inside the house is awful. It's awful. Addictions, incest, violence, all of it is just, it feels like the strata on which a person is born is broken, unhealthy, and unnourishing. And so what happens next is that, again, it's not about Israelis. It's about like when this happens, like in a tribal community, be it African countries or Eastern Asian countries, and then there's like the trauma that happens on the outside, the core of you is secure.
Mm.
Because society holds you, community holds you, tribe holds you. So you can fucking handle it, and that's your hero's journey. Sorry for swearing. Whereas what happens here is the opposite. Like you're sitting there and you're like, yeah, but my mom was talking badly to me and no one was seeing me as a child, which is like really traumatic. Don't get me wrong, but it comes again from this like wound of separation. So the addiction is almost, and people like call addictions heroes journeys here, which is like astounding to me. But it's like the core of the self is sitting on like a rotten ground, and then you're desolate and alone. No one sees you. You're in this like personality hellscape, and then you go into substances, you do all sorts of things, and then you manage to pull yourself out of it on your own somehow. And that's your hero's journey. It's like this like desolate alone process to come out of something that you did to yourself because your ground was unhealthy.
Mm.
And so the way that I see that connected to what you're asking about politics and future is that, and people are like, it's not going to be family values, it's going to be tribal consciousness. It's like, how do you, first of all, stop blaming your parents because they are in the same boat as you are? They suffered through the same thing. They themselves did not have a ground, and create the ground. How do you create those communities as you do that that nourish, that are compassionate but not enabling, that are assholes but not narcissistic and malevolent? So that's the dance. That's the place of health, and I really believe that that's where the work needs to be. It's
Yeah.
in community. It's in like really developing that sense of belonging, that sense of like secure attachment that has nothing to do with you and your mom. It has everything to do with you and your society, with you and your town, with you and your village.
Hmm. Yeah. I just want to share that um something I love about these conversations is not so much like whether Tucker as an individual sort of agrees or like has full resonance with every perspective, but the overall resonance I'm hearing from the wisdom that you're sharing with us just feels um important. It feels deeply important to me. Like it's doing something in my being that is motivating something that is beyond words, but it's like coming up through the earth and through me, and it's helping to shape, I think, a more intelligent response to that which I'm most in love with. And it's a love that comes partly from longing, but it's also a love that comes from a deep knowing. And it feels
Mm.
like shaping it in a specific way that isn't so much about all the little details, although those are really interesting, but it's more about like the overall essence that I feel like you're really bringing. So thank you for that. I have one last question, I think, because we're running a
Can I
little.
say something about the longing for 1 second?
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
this is where it's at. You're like hitting the nail on the head. If you lend yourself to the soul longing, then you're lending yourself to the truth of what is actually missing.
Mm,
And you have that knowing and you have that wisdom.
mhm,
And it is coming from lack. It's not here. You long for it. If you allow yourself to yearn, then you know what to become so that you will provide that.
mhm.
And it is not to just give your empathy endlessly. It is not helpful. And you know that. Like
Yeah.
when you are in front of a person that just like sucks your energy, empathy is not what's needed. Your longing is for connection. Your longing is for, I'm connected with you. You're with me. I see you. You see me. If you don't see me, I'm not seeing you. Like not, I'm seeing where you're at, but I'm not going to pour all of myself into you anymore. Yeah. So that's like really the practice is not to do this, say that, act this way, act that way. It's like feel into your soul's longing
Mm,
and embody that. Be the thing that is missing.
mm. Beautiful. Amen to that. All right, so just my last question. The empath. Sorry, remind me of the exact name of it again.
Hyper-empath
Yeah.
personality disorder. And it's just my terms, don't.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So what happens when that scales into a collective? So speaking of, say, a new intentional community, right? And there's 30 people that are there, and maybe there's one or two people that are expressing qualities we would consider narcissism or borderline. And but there's like that empath, hyper empath culture that kind of gets that's there in the collective. And one of the I don't know if it's a paradox, but it feels like a curiosity I have is when you said in Israel, you can't be cast out because you're part of tribe, and that like whole concept like isn't really there. But in intentional
Mhm.
communities, how does one hold boundaries while being with an adult that might be a narcissist, for example? And when do you actually have to like physically, literally cast the person out versus kind of being able to work with them within the culture that you're creating because they are a part of tribe and that's just what is.
So I don't, so again, from a non-dualistic perspective, there is no separation. Like there is no casting out. It just doesn't exist. They just can be in your community or not in your community, based on the acceptance of certain uh, standards or ways of being. And so I would say I call it like exclusive inclusivity or inclusive exclusivity. So the way that I would orient to something like that would be, hey, those are the values that this community holds. Um, Here are some of the ways that you can be more in alignment with that. And just know that if there is no alignment, then you're just like not a natural part of this way of being. And that's perfectly fine. Like I believe that you will have that in another place. But it's not like, yeah, fuck you. You're a bad person. We can't work with you anymore. It's more like, this is the offering. Those are the boundaries. Do you want to be part of this?
Mhm.
Are you willing to? And there are things that you can do to improve that and things that you might not want to, and that's perfectly fair. And if you don't, then it will mean that we'll part ways. And that's the same way I would say to just like deal with a partner that is like that. It's like to
Yeah.
say this is the values of this being and this is how I operate. And this doesn't land for me and we can meet this way or that way. And if not, then that's okay. We can say goodbye.
Can I interrupt with just a quick caveat to this, which is sometimes in the collective, the one who's displaying, say, narcissism is a part of the co-creation of the values, and therefore it like becomes more tricky because uh yeah, anyways, there's shared power that that person has, and it's not necessarily that they're just, you know what I mean? It's like the goalposts
I do
move.
know what you mean. And I will say that, and like one of the things that I've observed, sorry, in this country is that there are a lot of like communities that are not really communities. They're actually star-shaped uh, um, based on like one person in power or a few people in power in the center, and that it collects a lot of hyper empaths, people pleasing personalities around them. So the community is actually lovely because a lot of the people are very accommodating and sweet. And then the person in the center holds power. And a lot of people are afraid to be to create any rupture with the people in power because that means that they will be cast out. And
Mm.
so then you create a culture of acquiescence around a narcissistic personality. And it's not really a depth community. And so I would just like come to question the whole thing because it's not really a tribe. It's a narcissistic personality with a lot of hyper empaths around him.
Mhm.
That's something to pay attention to.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just maybe a final question, just from your own journey working with all of this. Yeah, do you have any like final words of wisdom or pro tips or any yeah, lasting pieces of advice that you might want to leave viewers with?
Well, I will say that I'm writing a lot about it. I'm writing actually two books about it right now. And I have a blog that covers a lot of the pieces. And so and I'm very available to answer questions if anyone wants to get that. Last pieces of advice is like really that there's no greater work than to lean into the authenticity of the soul and to drop as much of the story of I'm the victim of circumstances, I'm the victim of the parents uh, wounding, et cetera, and like just being like, this is the life that I have. This is who I am and what the gifts are that I have to bring. And how do I show up to this?
Mm.
Less whining.
I can get behind that prayer.
Yeah.
That boundary. Maybe we're setting a boundary right now.
It's a request. It's not a boundary.
All right. You're so generous. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Tucker. Pleasure to be with you.
Lots of love.